Hello, everyone. I'm Manu Jain Goyal, and welcome to our another session from East German chapter. And I'm truly delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Maia Salholz-Hillel. So today's session will focus on a critically important topic in biomedical research, clinical trial transparency, from registration to results reporting. So Dr. Salholz-Hillel is a research fellow at the Quest Center for Responsible Research, part of the Berlin Institute of Health at Charité. Her work centers on advancing responsible biomedical research practices with a particular emphasis on improving transparency in clinical trials. She brings a unique, well-rounded approach to her research, integrating both qualitative and quantitative methods and engaging with a broad range of stakeholders to drive meaningful and lasting change in the field. So without taking further time, I would like to hand over to Dr. Maia Salholz-Hillel. So please go on.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Manu. I do need to quickly say I am in the process of getting my degree, and we should be doing this in end of February, but so not quite doctor, but hopefully quite soon.
But you submitted your thesis, right?
Yes. This is not my only big talk this fall. Let's put it that way. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. I can see from the chat that people are still joining, so I'm going to just take my time for a second to make sure that everyone is here. You should now be able to see my slides.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, then I want to just get started by acknowledging that I was supposed to be joined today by my colleague, Nick DeVito. Unfortunately, he's had a conflict, so you will just be hearing from me today for this webinar on clinical trial transparency. So in today's talk, I'm going to start by introducing clinical trial transparency. I'm not quite sure who's in the audience, so I want to make this an inclusive presentation. So it's okay if you are new to trials. I'm then going to discuss several specific trial transparency practices that editors can support. And finally, I will share some ideas with evidence where there is evidence available for how editors, journals, and publishers can support trial transparency. Again, today's webinar is primarily geared to editors of journals that publish trials, but I do hope that lessons learned from trials could also inform your efforts on broader research transparency. So, what is a clinical trial? According to the World Health Organization, or WHO, a clinical trial is any research study that prospectively assigns human participants or groups of humans to one or more health-related intervention to evaluate the effect on health outcomes. Importantly, interventions are not limited to drugs, but they can also include devices, procedures, behavioral treatments, and more. A well-conducted clinical trial provides novel evidence that helps distinguish beneficial interventions from those with minimal, no, or even harmful effects. Findings across many trials can then be gathered, synthesized, and appraised in systematic reviews. This totality of evidence across a single clinical question underpins evidence-based medicine, and this, in turn, allows for safe and effective treatments to reach patients. However, much like an iceberg, trial evidence can get buried beneath the surface. This prevents us from looking at the whole picture and can then have detrimental costs to patient care. So, how do these trials end up beneath the surface? Reporting bias. Reporting bias is the selective reporting or withholding of information across the study lifecycle, from design and conduct to analysis and results. Common types of reporting bias are publication bias, which is the publication or non-publication of results based on the nature and direction of findings, and time lag bias, which is the timeliness of results publication based on the nature and direction of findings. To combat reporting bias, recent years have seen a rise in standards for trial transparency. These include ethical standards, such as the Declaration of Helsinki and various WHO guidelines, legal requirements, though these are often limited to drug and to a lesser extent device trials. There are also practical standards from the ICMJE, which is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which you might be part of, that guide publishing at many journals, the Spirit and Consort Reporting Guidelines that help researchers report transparently, and the establishment of numerous international clinical trial registries, which are gathered under the umbrella of the WHO's ICTRP. The ICTRP registries span the entire globe, with the US-based clinicaltrials.gov at the fore, the EU Clinical Trials Register, and more recently, Clinical Trials Information System, mandated for European drug trials, and since we're in Germany and East Germany, the German Clinical Trials Register, or DRKS. So, what actually makes a trial transparent? Well, first off, investigators should register their trial in one of the ICTRP registries and should update the registration throughout the trial lifecycle. After the trial is complete, investigators should share their findings both in the registry and in a journal article. As these are the most regulated and researched practices, I'll be focusing on these today, but I want you to note that there are numerous other practices that help trials be transparent, such as posting the study protocol and data sharing. Now that we have an understanding of clinical trial transparency, why should you, as EASE members and journal editors, care? Well, journal publications are a very important aspect of transparency, and you, as editors, are well positioned to be able to act and improve transparency. This, in turn, can benefit a journal's quality and reputation. What trial transparency practices can editors support? In other words, what can you concretely do after receiving a manuscript? I will now highlight several practices based on previously mentioned trial transparency standards, and from my perspective as a researcher working to improve trial transparency. Please do keep in mind that I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a legal expert, so none of today's webinar should be considered legal advice. Also, I'm not a journal editor myself, so I do not expect this to capture your full picture, and I welcome you to take with you whatever is helpful. First, it's important to determine whether the manuscript reports on a clinical trial. Depending on your journal's manuscript submission system, authors may be asked to specify whether they are submitting a trial, but given that there are varied understandings of what constitutes a trial, a quick check can help confirm that the study should really be reported as a clinical trial. First, keep in mind the WHO's definition, which I shared before, and again, is any human intervention with a health outcome. Next, you'll want to consider any journal or publisher-specific definition. For example, the Nature journals stay quite close to WHO's language, whereas clinical trials expands the definition beyond health outcomes. So even though the primary endpoint may or may not be a health outcome. Once you've determined that this is a clinical trial, you should consider the type of trial article, since reporting expectations might differ. For example, study protocols and statistical analysis plans may be published prior to the trial's completion, whereas results articles published after a trial's completion may have different expectations. Next, you should consider whether the trial has been appropriately registered. Here, I'd like to turn to the ICMJE, which requires registration of clinical trials in a public trial registry at or before the time of first patient enrollment as a condition of consideration for publication. So your first step is to consider whether the trial is registered in an appropriate registry or registries. Please do keep in mind that what the trial type is and where it was conducted, since in many jurisdictions, drug and to a lesser extent device trials must be registered where they are conducted. Also, in general, a trial should be registered in a single registry unless a cross-registration in another registry is strictly necessary. For example, due to legal or funder requirements. So, as an example, if a new COVID treatment drug is being tested with participants in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany, that trial should be registered in the US's clinicaltrials.gov, the UK's ISRCTN, and the EU's Clinical Trials Information System. One note of caution, non-health interventions, like the research on research that I conduct, should not be registered in ICTRP registries. Instead, authors should be using an appropriate registry, such as one of the Open Science Framework registries. As also specified by the ICMJE, trials should be registered prospectively, meaning before the first patient, first visit. If a trial is registered retrospectively, either during the conduct of the trial or during the publication process, this should be clearly stated in the manuscript. Since the registration itself only includes limited information about the trial's conduct and analysis, the trial should also post or publish its protocol and statistical analysis plan, and these should be clearly linked in the registry and publication. This has also been formalized in the 2025 WHO guidance, so I do expect to see more movement and pressure in this direction. The next practice to keep in mind is posting of summary results in the registry. This should be done within 12 months of trial completion. And this is according to ethical guidelines like this one from the World Health Organization, as well as for some trials and jurisdictions by law. What this means for you is that if you receive a trial with a completion date more than 12 months prior, you should be able to find the summary results in the registry. If not, the editorial phase is an opportunity to prompt or require authors to post their summary results. If a trial is cross-registered in more than one registry, the results should be posted or at least findable in any of the registrations. So here you can see an example of a trial which was cross-registered in both the EU Clinical Trials Register and clinicaltrials.gov, and it has correctly posted summary results in both registries. One common concern that I hear from investigators is that posting summary results in the registry could count as prior publication and therefore jeopardize their chances of a journal publication. But the ICMJ clearly states that posting of summary results in an ICTRP registry does not count as prior publication. Some journals, such as the BMC, make this explicit in their instructions to authors, and you as editors can emphasize this to your authors. In fact, registry results and journal publications are complementary. According to the updated WHO guidance, journal publications adhering to the consort guidance provide peer-reviewed narrative insights that are not available in registries. This brings me to the next practice, consort and other reporting guidelines, for which the question to you is the appropriate reporting guideline shared and followed? You should first consider whether an appropriate guideline was used according to the design, intervention, and data of the study. The Consort and Spirit website provides a list of extensions to the original guidelines. While you may not review all 30 items of the Consort or other checklist, you could do a quick sense check to confirm that the checklist and flowchart were correctly provided in the manuscript. And while all 30 consort items are important to transparency, I just want to highlight the open science section, which is new in the 2025 update. It includes practices that were already in previous consort versions, such as reporting the trial registration identifier, and it also adds important practices such as data sharing and declaring sources of funding and conflicts of interest. If you would like to learn more about data sharing and how your journal can support data availability, I encourage you to watch my colleague Evgeny Bobrov's webinar, which is available on EASE's YouTube channel. I also want to highlight one more important practice detailed in Consort, but that falls outside of this open science section, and this is outcome reporting. since outcome switching between the trial registration and publication has been extensively researched and is prevalent, unfortunately. And this sheds doubt on research conclusions when such important changes are left unreported and unaddressed. So I would encourage you to check this other important aspect when you're doing a quick sense check. So I know I've only just scratched the surface of trial transparency practices that you as editors can support. But I'd like to zoom out now beyond specific practices to explore some ideas about how editors, journals, and publishers might be able to support trial transparency. The first avenue, of course, is checking. All of the practices I elaborated in the previous section and the numerous that I skipped over require time and effort to be checked. And not surprisingly, in a survey and interviews with journal editors, Fuller and colleagues found that time was a barrier to checking reporting guideline checklists. One editor shared, "Editors say, I've got enough to do. They don't have the resources or time, and I'm very aware of this issue." However, even if editors do have the resources, the COMPARE study, which wrote letters to editors about inconsistencies between trial results articles and their registrations, learned that editors don't necessarily see these checks as the journal's responsibility. The New England Journal of Medicine replied to the COMPARE team, "Any interested reader can compare the published article, the trial registration, and the protocol." The COMPARE team reflected on this difference between endorsing in spirit and enforcing in practice, and suggested offering a system to check and accredit compliance for journals wishing to demonstrate credibility to readers. This system is definitely far from being in place, but in the meanwhile, another avenue beyond checking articles yourself as editors would be to provide additional support to peer reviewers. These avenues include making trial-specific expectations clear to reviewers, reminding reviewers to review reporting checklists, and asking reviewers to check registrations. Unfortunately, to date, there's been relatively little research into whether and how intervening in peer review is effective. 2 randomized controlled trials evaluated whether asking peer reviewers to check reporting guidelines improved reporting completeness. Unfortunately, they did not see improved completeness compared to peer reviewers who had not been prompted. So there's definitely more research needed to understand how peer reviewers can be supported towards trial transparency. But given that editors, peer reviewers, and authors alike are all strapped for time, yet another idea would be to improve automation in peer review and editorial workflows. In a commentary with several colleagues, we concluded that automated screening tools cannot replace peer review, but they may aid authors, reviewers, and editors in improving scientific papers. Quality metadata can then help facilitate increased and improved automation. So another avenue would be to extend and tailor metadata collection. For example, Trials requires authors to provide details of their trial registration as metadata when they submit their manuscript. These instructions also reiterate the journal's understanding of trials and also reminds authors to include the registration information within the manuscript itself. Once the metadata is collected, journals should be depositing it to centralized research infrastructure such as Crossref, so that the various strands of evidence about a trial can be linked. For example, if a trial provides metadata with the article DOI and the trial registration number, Crossref can generate a visual representation showing the publication and registration. If you would like to learn more about Crossref and metadata, you can watch this other previous EASE Germany webinar, which is also available on EASE's YouTube channel. Taking a more top-down approach, journals and publishers can mandate transparency practices for trials and beyond. For example, the BMJ now mandates data and code sharing, and announced just this month, trials will require more transparent reporting of participant demographics. I'd also like to highlight the opportunity for you to use the editorial phase to nudge investigators towards more transparency. For example, the ICMJE encourages authors to update the results registry with the full journal citation. You could remind authors about this when providing them with their upcoming paper's DOI and citation. Finally, you can help push trial transparency forward by contributing to research. While the issues of trial transparency are well established, we need better solutions to address these problems. As you saw in the last slides, more research is needed to generate ideas and test interventions. And journals and editors like you are crucial to this. Meta-researchers are eager to work together with experts like you to try out ideas and move us towards a more transparent trial landscape. Before we come to the Q&A, I'd like to preview where all of this is going, meaning what this transparent trial landscape could look like. First, a trial would be ideally registered in the appropriate registries. And this trial is a COVID drug trial that recruited in 3 countries, or 3 jurisdictions: the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. So it was appropriately registered in all 3 registries. Next, the results should be reported. And you can see this trial reported its results in 2 of the 3 registries. It then posted a preprint and posted a journal article. And all of this was done in a timely fashion. Finally, this metadata should all be interlinked so that the publication is linked inside of the registration with the DOI, and the trial registration number is linked inside of the publication, not only in the full text, but also in the abstract. If all publications and registrations of trials would look like this, we would be able to move towards a trial research landscape in which you can enter the thread at any point and travel in either direction to find out more about the design, conduct, and outcome of the study. This would eventually benefit evidence-based medicine and patient care. I also want to emphasize that research transparency is important beyond trials. And there are resources that address this broader effort that go beyond today's talk. I'll just briefly highlight the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines, or TOP, which were most recently updated this year. And these include 7 research transparency practices, which you can see closely mirror those I've discussed in the context of clinical trials, for example, including study registration. So, what are the key takeaways for clinical trial transparency and what you as editors can do? You as editors can support appropriate trial registration. You can support the posting of registry summary results and the proper use of reporting guidelines. Editors, journals, and publishers more broadly can support trial transparency by checking and enforcing, supporting peer reviewers, improving automation, collecting and depositing metadata, mandating and nudging transparency, and contributing to research. I want to thank you so much for your time and your attention. I've tried to keep this input talk quite short so that there's opportunity for questions, since I didn't know where everyone was coming for in today's talk, and I look forward to a productive Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Yeah, I can see now my video. Thank you, Maya, for such a wonderful talk. And I totally agree with your points that the trials should be registered in an appropriate registries and results should be reported, and all these results and publications should be linked and transparent. And we as an editorial team or editorial from the editorial office, we should do cross-check to improve and bring the transparency and do the research based on these results. So now we would like to take some questions. So we have some questions. So we have one question from Sridhar. Is it mandatory the CTR needs to be registered in all study related to humans, um, physiotherapy or Ayurveda, nursing, or any field?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And I will have to come back to the point that it really depends on the jurisdiction you're in and the requirements. And that makes your job as editors, I can only imagine, incredibly difficult because you're probably also not legal experts. So, the short answer is it depends. Mostly drug and device trials are regulated, but again, that depends where you are. So I'm sitting in Germany, which is within the European Union, and we have the CTR. I don't know if that's what you meant, but we have the clinical trial registration regulation from the EU from 2014, I believe, and this makes the registration of drug trials mandatory, but it does not control or does not mandate these practices for physiotherapy and other types of trials that fall outside of the definition of drug trials, which are also medicinal products. So I have to say, this means you need to check and possibly ask the authors to justify whether or not they're a trial. But again, there are incentives for authors, and at least in my own work working with investigators, and speaking with other stakeholders who are in this space, such as funders, where people don't want to identify their research as subject to the requirements because they know it adds burden. And again, I recognize that everyone, editors, researchers, are overburdened, but it is an ethical imperative. I need to touch on what goes beyond the mandates, because if we just stick to what is legally required, in my opinion, that's not sufficient. You have humans that are taking a risk and taking their time to participate in the trials, no matter what. The drug trials and investigational medicinal products have maybe higher risks, and that's why they're subject to regulations. But I think the ethical mandate, not the legal mandate, is there for every sort of human intervention where there is a health outcome. Otherwise, we don't get the full thread of evidence. Yeah.
So we have another question from Monira. Do we need to register observational study also?
Okay, so observational studies, I'm going to break this down into two parts. I'm going to talk about observational clinical studies first, and then we can talk about observational studies beyond clinical studies. So I think that any human subject research should be registered. If you think of registration simply as saying in advance what you are planning to do. And this is, however, more of an ethical imperative, because observational studies, again, are going to fall outside of most of these regulations. But again, I have to turn you back to wherever the research is being conducted. That's going to be the jurisdiction that it falls under. But from an ethical imperative, they should be registered. I do want to highlight here that they should be registered appropriately. So it would not be good to register an observational study and say it's an intervention. You need to make sure you're registering it, or the author should make sure that they're registering it in a registry that allows for observational studies. So, for example, this is possible in clinicaltrials.gov, which allows both interventional and observational studies to be registered. I want to go beyond the clinical observational studies here. For example, I did say that I conduct interventions as a meta researcher, but I'm doing research on research, so my outcomes are not health outcomes. So here I would not register in a clinical trial registry. And here I would also say, if you're doing an observational study where you don't have a health outcome, you should not be using one of these clinical trial registries, even if you're able to highlight and specify that this is an observational study, in which case you should be using the appropriate registry. So again, there's the Open Science Framework, which has a list of several registries, but there's also several preclinical registries that I'm not an expert in. But I believe there's another EASE webinar that's on preclinical. So maybe Manu can point you in the right direction for that.
Okay. So we have another question from Sridhar. Can we get registered trials list or website from where we can get? Kindly share the link to understand the clinical trials ongoing.
So I'm going to do my best to address your question. If I don't answer it, please just ping me. So the first thing is there a list of all registered trials? There is in theory. The World Health Organization's ICTRP, which I mentioned at the beginning and showed that big map, the World Health Organization has a website. I can add a link into the end of the slides before it's shared with you. And they try to gather all of the registrations across all of the ICTRP registries. The database, like many other things in the clinical space, are under-resourced. So it's hard to use that data. And I'm not sure, like even as a data scientist, it takes a lot of post-processing. So there's definitely some issues with access to it that needs further investment. Manu, I think the question went away, but there was a second, but kindly share the link. Yeah, to understand the trials that are ongoing. That brings me to the second point. You said the trials that are ongoing. This is another issue with the with the registries, is that the metadata is not always kept up to date, which is why I highlighted that the registration needs to not only be done, but it needs to be, excuse me, it needs to be updated. So just because something is listed as ongoing in the registry does not necessarily mean it is ongoing. So this requires a lot of work. And again, I mean, I'm sure you're all very busy, so maybe making this a dialogue with the authors as much as possible and asking them to justify and explain what's going on rather than you having to run this down between the registries. So asking them to provide that link to the registration, which you can then take a look at. And if something looks funky, then you can get back to them, right? I think it is a matter of dialogue. And I mean, I've definitely gotten many back and forth emails from editors when they needed a clarification. So that would be my advice.
So we have another question from Julia. So she says, thank you for the presentation, very interesting. Do you know the rationale behind the requirement that a clinical trial must be registered at or before the trial start date for the publication to be considered as valid, especially given that some regulations, such as the final rule, have compliance deadlines that fall after the trial's initiation, that is 21 days after the study start?
So thank you for this great question. I'm going to take a step back in case people are less familiar with some of the things you've brought up in this question. So to repeat this question, basically you're saying, why did I emphasize that the registration should be at or prior to study start instead of within 21 days of study start? Because that is the requirement in the United States under what is called the final rule from the Food and Drug Administration for drug trials and other trials that fall under that rule in the United States. I actually would flip the question around and ask, why does the US use that definition? Because if you think of the purpose of registration, the idea of it is simply to give us a snapshot of what you were planning to do before you started doing it. So that's the rationale, to say what were you planning in advance so that you couldn't change it. We just want to be able to know when we're looking at your results, did you change things that you had planned to do, which is completely fine and happens, especially with human participants and recruitment issues and, for example, adaptive trials. But we just want to have a snapshot before. I'm not enough of an expert on the final rule to say why it is 21 days, but my intuition is that it's done as a sort of grace period because of the complexity of this whole process, and that even though we've been kind of on this evidence-based medicine journey since the 80s and registration since the early 2000s, that this still is complicated, and we do still see retrospectively registered trials outside of this 21 days. But Yeah, I can't actually answer exactly why the 21 days, but I hope I've answered your questions about the ethical imperative to make the snapshot beforehand.
Thank you. So I actually I do have a question. Since we touched upon the editorial submissions and the overburden, so what would be your thoughts and comments where editors can find a balance, between encouraging the transparency and still avoiding the like overly burdened submission requirements? What would you recommend or suggest on that?
Okay, so I guess there's twofold. There's the burden on you as editors, and there's also the burden on authors. Maybe I'll start with the burden on authors and actually by challenging it, because I have, like many other researchers, I've been trying to make my own work more and more transparent. I'm not conducting clinical trials, but I'm conducting other research. And what I've learned is as I improve my own documentation for myself,
Mhm.
if if the manuscript submission system gives me an easier way to insert that information, then it's not a problem, right?
Yeah,
Especially if that information is linked and can be connected.
true.
So I would actually say that the burden on authors, if you're doing the work and the backend system is linked to reduce the manual burden, that it shouldn't be that much. So I guess that I'm going to come back to this whole collecting metadata, really making it as easy as possible to get what you need from authors, giving them the instructions right at that point. You won't be able to do this all on your own, and it's very annoying to have to deal with a chaotic manuscript submission system and then have to repeat it in multiple set submission systems, so making it as easy as possible. And then again, there's more long-term changes like the infrastructure, which should be shared so that the manuscript submission systems are linked so that when I've entered my metadata at one journal, it can be forwarded after my rejection to another journal, etc. So I would say, yeah, making things as easy as possible from research for researchers, because while we wait for all these bigger infrastructure changes, we do need to move forward. Then to make it easier on you, um, I think that, well, first off, if you get better, clearer information from the researchers, you won't have to do as much on your end because there will be less going back and forth. Um, and then, I mean, one thing that we have seen from the same article that I referenced about having the time is that having someone in a role that's dedicated to clinical trials where their attention is able to be focused on this, so it becomes more of a pattern, is very beneficial. So if you are in a trial focused journal or a journal with a lot of trials, it might be worth discussing whether that would be a specialty that someone could have. Yeah, but otherwise, I don't know. If I knew how to make time, I would. I can just emphasize the importance of sometimes following your values at personal or professional costs, but I may not be the most wise on that front. So,
Thank you. But like people so they are not from a clinical background, like including me. So
mhm,
what would you suggest could be like a basic integrity check to do just to know if the results or the reportings which are provided in the manuscript or the registry number, things like that are okay, just
mhm,
not to go maybe not into detail, but at least just for a first check to
mhm,
do.
mhm. So that was why I did that section where I was trying to go step through step
Mhm.
of checking things. So I will share the slides with you and they can be shared with everyone. So maybe that is helpful. I did quite a bit of research ahead of this talk to try to find resources and guidelines that are specific to trial editing, even from trial specific journals. And I couldn't find anything, which doesn't mean it's not out there. But yeah, I also was wondering if there is some sort of a checklist for editors. So this was my attempt to highlight a few specific things. So I will just emphasize those again, which was the first, make sure you're looking at a clinical trial. Yes, you're going to have to use your judgment
Yeah,
based on in the end, but you are scientists, right?
right.
I will struggle with a preclinical review, but I can make some basic judgments of this. And then check the registration. right? You can for sure check whether a registration number is reported, whether it goes to the registry, whether it looks like it's the same trial. This is something that can, again, use your judgment on that front. Yeah, and then same with results reporting, check if the results have been reported, if it's in the registry, if it's over 12 months past completion.
Right.
Um, yeah, and then you could go through the entire consort or other checklist, but that's a huge burden. I've had some conversations with colleagues who say, okay, what about just quickly sense checking 3 or 4
Mhm.
items at random, which is why I also highlighted outcome reporting because that's one that we do see quite a bit of switching and is pretty easy. You can look at the registration, which says, these were our 3 outcomes, and the paper, and it says these were our 3 outcomes, and if those don't match, that's a
Okay.
good red flag. But yeah, this would be definitely something that I see a gap. Yeah. Is this something that Ease could help develop? I see from Mary in the chat. I think that would be amazing because again,
Yeah.
this brings me to the last point that I put just the word research because we know that we know there's a problem and we know that most actors are trying that we're trying our best.
Right.
But we're out of resources. So having things that are effective, and that's not something that I as a researcher can develop. It's something that maybe I can use my research expertise to work with the stakeholder group to develop. But yeah, I definitely think that this would be a great place for ease. And maybe if you're in partnership with ICMJE or
Mhm.
COPE, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, because journals and publishers do need guidelines to support and enhance the transparency and accountability of the clinical trial uh, data. That's true. So, but now we are uh, hearing every day like the new AI tools, and we are in the AI generation.
Hmm.
Do you see any promising technological innovation that could, help in enhancing transparency and accountability of the clinical trial data?
Yeah, so I tried to touch on this very briefly in this automation slide. I do think automation, whether we call it artificial intelligence or just more that is not done by us, but that is done by computers, is definitely coming. And the question is, how do we make it beneficial for us? So it needs to be of a decent quality. And I just want to highlight again what we said in this commentary, which is that I don't see it going beyond a support
Mhm.
because in the end you are there as an expert, as a scientific expert to weigh in, and I doubt that a tool will replace that, and I ethically don't think a tool should replace that. um, I I'm not aware of some tool that I would name and recommend to anyone right now, for specific practice. But I mean, if you this paper is linked in the presentation I will share, and it references a few tools that my colleagues and I put together in some sort of a pipeline, and we then, yeah, to test out whether this could help if we flagged potential issues for people. So I do think that that automated tools, AI or otherwise, will be able to do that first check of maybe quickly scanning the internet and all the registries, and filling in that gap.
Yeah, the registries which are mentioned, at least they could provide if they are real, really exist, or to these tools. I mean,
Maybe I'm not sure that AI is great at saying what's real,
okay.
but
Okay.
but that might be slightly off topic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But what do you think, like, besides like editorial teams or editors, like who could make who can promote to play role in this transparency, like especially the funders and the ethics committee? I mean, they
Mm-hmm.
play a great role coming to these clinical trials. So what would you think, like what role they could play here?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, Happy to answer that question. I'm right now working on a project with funders of clinical trials. I don't actually work with editors. So this is me for the first time trying to talk to you all. But I, again, would be very happy to continue this conversation going if this is something your journal is interested in working on. So it is definitely a multi-stakeholder environment. I spent the beginning of my research in this space working with the university medical centers who are running, quite a few trials alongside industry investigators and industry funders and sponsors. I also then worked with individual investigators. So that's two groups, the universities, the investigators. I'm now working with funders. You also have to consider policymakers and regulators who are deciding, coming back to this very first question about what is mandated.
Right.
And then also have to think about international organizations. So, for example, the World Health Organization, which is, doing amazing work with trying to do amazing work with limited resources to move things forward. So, I mean, I'm focusing on funders right now because I do think that, like I highlighted for you, I think that I don't want to use the word gatekeeping, but gate moments. So
Mhm.
if you are in some sort of a position in a trial's life cycle where you have the power to say, yes, go forward, or no, I'm going to hold you back, that's quite a bit of power to have. And
Yeah.
that's one thing that you have as publishers, which is why you can also, or publishers, editors, journals, you can act on, right? Because I want to publish my research. I'm a scientist. That's my reward system. So if you tell me you need to go and do this thing, I will do this thing, right? And same with funders. I want money. So if you say I need to go do this thing, I will do this thing. So I think trying to work at these points where there are kind of natural incentives help. But of course, like I have to come back to the infrastructure providers, and we should make this work easier. It's compared to the trial itself, transparency practices are just not that complicated, but because of the burden of the infrastructure, and that this is a behavioral change issue, this becomes a much more complex issue than the underlying practice, for example, of simply pasting a DOI into a registry or pasting a trial registration number into your manuscript. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So talking about incentives and behavioral issue, I would like to ask one more question. Sorry that I have so many
No,
questions.
it's okay. I see no one has any other questions, so I hope I haven't lost everybody in this topic.
I would like to ask, like, what incentives and accountability, like mechanisms that might help in shifting, these behavioral changes towards, making data in like greater transparency.
Yeah, what incentives exist? So I can talk about some experiments or data-driven things. I can first give you my perspective on this. I think there's lacking incentives. We are still very much in a publisher perish culture, which is
Yeah.
again why I think that you as editors
Right.
could have quite a bit of power in this. But again, you need the time to do this work, and I'm sure you don't. Um, Investigators are incentivized to publish articles, not to make the registration clean and clear, not to publish the data, not to make the links between their multifaceted evidence well connected. So
Mhm.
the incentives are definitely lacking. Now, in terms of efforts that are trying to change this, there have been quite a few different projects on this. So one very well-known one, and now this is beyond just trials, from the same organization that has the transparency and openness priorities, I think it is, the top that I mentioned at the end. Or promotion, sorry. It's was a badging system. So making badges on publications that said you have open code and you have open data to try to incentivize that behavior. My institute and I'm at the Quest Center for Responsible Research, which is hosted within the Charité
Mhm.
Universitätsmedizin Berlin, which is Europe's biggest hospital. We ran an intervention, which I'm not sure was written. It was not by me, another team that I'm not sure was run as a research intervention, but they were giving money, so bonuses, the same way that you would have other bonuses for doing some of these practices. But again, I don't have research on specific, or enough research that I can say here's the interventions that we need. But we definitely need to change research assessment, which starts bleeding into COARA, the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, and DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, and that whole movement, because if we don't change what investigators are incentivized to do, it's really hard to make them care even about a badge. Yeah.
Right. So thank you. Thank you. So I see there are no other questions. So I would like to then wind up. So thank you again for the wonderful discussion. And if you have further questions, I'm sure they can reach out to Maia. And Mary just posted that there's upcoming webinars on 21st October and 23rd October from EASE. So do register and join these webinars. And thank you again, Maia, for today's session, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And yeah, have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.